Two rival premium toy companies come back with a vengeance. After a year since the release of the movie, we got SH Figuarts versus Mafex in the battle for the best Robert Pattinson Batman. Officially, we do have Figuarts kind of beating Mafex to the punch, but still, I feel like there was a little bit of a game of chicken happening here where it was like, you released it first, you released it first. Not unlike InArt versus Hot Toys right now, because I personally feel like both of those figures are near completion and they could technically crunch to get them out, but they're just waiting for one company to make the first move over the other so they can see which one truly fails and which one comes up short in certain departments. And that's not necessarily too different at all here with what was happening between Figuarts and Mafex, because I feel like, being that the movie has been out for almost a year and a half, almost 2 years coming up here in March in 2024, you would think that these figures would be released a little earlier to kind of build up on that hype. It looks like there was a bit of a gap in terms of time, and we finally got both, and I'm here to tell you exactly which one goes for the better quality, for the better build, and for your best bang for your buck. There were an awful lot of bees there, but being that we're dealing with the Batman, it kind of fits very suitably. Let's start off with scale. You can definitely see that proportions and scale is going to favor very much the Mafex. You'll see that the Mafex is just a little bit on the taller side. He looks like he is the even 6 inches, whereas the Figuarts is just half an inch, maybe a quarter inch or so, a little bit shorter and a little stubbier looking. And it really doesn't help that the entire shoulder area kind of makes him look like he's scrunching a little bit. So it's almost like he's doing that on purpose. So it's a shame that you can definitely see an awful lot of the proportioning and the scaling favoring the Mafex just a little bit better. I don't know what was happening there. Maybe they were trying to make sure that the Figuarts was a bit more in line with the rest of the Figuarts that are released amongst the Marvel and DC line, because they probably figured that you're going to be putting that on that respective shelf. But at the same time, they weren't really taking into account the slight lankiness, because Robert Pattinson, he's kind of a tall guy. He's not necessarily a super tall guy, but he's taller than your traditional Batman. Most notably, much taller than Keaton. But it looks like maybe they were trying to put him still on that scale so that it's an even plane. Wow, I totally didn't mean to do that. Versus that of the Mafex. The Mafex looks like he's a little bit more to scale, a little bit more slim-fitting, if you will. He's meant to be a much more slimmer Batman. He looks a little lankier. He looks like he's, like I said, going for that much more tactical approach to his suit. And once again, I feel like I wanted to reserve this for later, but I need to comment on it. It's that stupid plastic piece around the shoulder area for the Figuarts that really does a humongous disservice to the scaling and the proportioning of that build, because it just makes him look like he's shrunken down, and it looks like he's just kind of hunching over his shoulders to make him look like he's brooding a lot more. But at the same time, it just looks, the proportions look a whole lot off. It looks like he's wearing a trash bag over that area. And when you kind of rotate it towards the back, you'll notice that, yeah, it then leans into a cloth kind of build for the overall look of the cape, and it just looks ugly. If anything, you know what this reminds me of? It looks like that thing that Anakin has over his chest in Attack of the Clones, or rather the Clone Wars specifically, both the cartoon and a recent look at the character that was released out there. I mean, you do a quick Google search, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it reminds me an awful lot of that, and the mixed media happening here between the cloth and the plastic build of this top piece here. I understand what the intention was, to make it look like it's flushing down better, and in an effort to favor the wiring that's happening on the outer rim of the cape. But overall, it just looks ugly and just did not do it service. And again, to me, I think the biggest sin that it's performing here is just making it look like he's scrunching and shrugging and slouching his overall posture. And it just looks terrible. Whereas the Mafex, straight from the beginning, where it's kind of seamed and built into the shoulder area here, you'll notice that it's coiling and wrapping itself around the collar, kind of like it does in the real suit, and the wiring actually begins from there, and it's all just one solid piece made out of the same fabric, where you have cloth on the inside, but then you have kind of like this painted on material on the top side that doesn't really, it kind of feels like nylon, but at the same time I feel like it isn't. It just feels like this painted on kind of fabric. And the wiring is still through and through from the beginning here, where it wraps around the collar, to the very ends, as opposed to mixing it up with the plastic here on the Figuarts. And therefore, it just looks like one solid blended piece that you can then kind of futz and mold to look a bit more screen accurate to the way that it does in the movie. And overall, most importantly, at least to me, doesn't look like he's shrugging. It doesn't look like he's ruining his posture. He's actually standing tall and standing menacingly like the Batman is supposed to look like. So therefore, you look at this entire area right here and it looks pretty badass. It looks pretty screen accurate. And sure, it may not be on the same level as a Hot Toys or even a Ninart once they get their particular product out on the line, but overall, you kind of futz a little bit with the cape, kind of make it drip a little, like halfway, not completely over the shoulders, but just a little bit towards the back, but not all the way to where it's terribly narrow here on his shoulder plates. And there you go. You have pretty much a very screen accurate look to the way that the cape is supposed to look like. And overall, the actual quality of the cape is pretty premium. You still have the 4 wires, 2 on the outer rim, and then 2 here in the middle that you can stylize in any way you want. And overall, it just already automatically gives the leg up to the Mafex. They knew exactly what they were doing. That just makes this guy look pretty much like a centerpiece, even when he's in a very neutral position like this. And just look at that. Just look at the difference. Sure, it doesn't necessarily touch the bottom of the floor, but that's kind of what Pattinson's Batman was going for. He was going for something that's not going to risk dripping. It also looks like it's not risk him tripping whenever he's walking or running if he has to make a sudden dash. And more importantly, it looks like something that he made himself. Definitely screen accurate over here on the Mafex camp, whereas Figuarts, sure, you can maybe style it in a way that it looks like it's blowing in the wind, but you just see just how much real estate, you could say, it's taking up over here. And it just looks like the cape itself is kind of bringing him down. It's just going to, anchoring him and weighing him down and just overall ruining his posture. And by that distinction, you can kind of already tell where I'm leaning here in terms of looks, in terms of screen accuracy. It is, in fact, the Mafex, because cape aside, you still have this overall color palette that just looks a bit more screen accurate over on the Mafex. It kind of goes for this yellowish tint to the gray that very much comes through on the torso area, on the chest. You even have some weathering, some scraping happening with the bat symbol there on the middle of his chest. And you even have much more screen accurate looks to the arms and the legs, where you have, like I said, that smoky kind of gray versus the shoulder plating that is pretty much a very dark black. But that's exactly how it looked like in the movie, especially during some of the much more lit up areas, like when he's, taking down Catwoman, or you see a little bit of him in the daytime when he's waiting for Catwoman on the top of the skyscraper, or even towards the end of the movie. You'll notice that that's pretty much how screen accurate the suit is actually supposed to look like versus how it does over here on the Figuarts. Which is a tad ironic for me to say that I do like to give the Figuarts just a little bit of credit, the uniformity happening with that color scheme. I actually do like the actual color itself. If I was to be a bit more subjective, I do like the much more jet black color to the Figuarts, even though it's technically not screen accurate. I understand that. I do like the uniformity of it all. I do like how this is pretty much, if you were to ask me what specific shade of black I would like to have on my utilities at home, whether it be my TV, my soundbar, my consoles, this is pretty much the matte black that I would love. And therefore, on a subjective note, I do like that look on Batman. But I appreciate the screen accuracy of the Mafex much, much more. And therefore, if you want like a one-to-one representation of that version in the scale, in that premium quality, Mafex still has it in the bag. Nevertheless, though, this is where we start to then bleed into similarities where it's kind of pick and choose at this point, and that's going to be all the little details when it comes to the gadgets, the stuff that's kind of strapped onto the figure itself, whether it be the little holster that he has here on the right thigh. The utility belt as a whole is pretty much one-to-one between the two characters, or between the two representations in the two companies. The only little distinctions that I noticed is maybe the little bit of chrome utilized here for the little silver parts and the buckles that are kind of holding everything together. You'll see that there's some subtle changes, some subtle differences depending on which company, and at that point it then becomes a little subjective as to who you prefer. And then you have those little yellow accents you see popping in here and there on the bicep and on the belt area, and even a little bit here on the boot. That then depends on who you're asking. Me personally, I actually do like the darker, much more gold orangey yellow that we have on the Mafex versus the slightly bright and out of place on the Figuarts. Even though I like this shade of gray, I really don't like the shade of yellow they used for those little accents. And you can still see a little bit of them coming through here on the bat symbol on both of the characters, but it still remains consistent with whatever hue they chose on that color wheel. So again, at that point, it becomes preferential. For me personally, I like the Mafex version better, but everything else just kind of starts to bleed together and kind of blend in a way where it just takes a matter of preference as to which one you prefer, whether it be the shade of the gauntlets and the spikes, the chrome and the gray, and the airbrush that they decided to use on the gauntlets themselves and the boots as well. And even the little bit of wear you can see and the dirt that you can kind of make out a little bit on the boots and on the shoes to make them look a little bit more worn and tattered. One other area that we need to talk about that's humongously important when it comes to spending this amount of money on such a small figure, and that's going to be the facial recognition and the actual head sculpt and likeness they were able to manage to secure at this scale, because it's very difficult for a company, whether it be McFarlane, Marvel Legends, to nail the likeness of a character that they're taking from a movie and nail it in this capacity. When you're dealing with such a small figure, it's very difficult to nail likenesses and little details to make it look like that's that actor that you're actually picking up. And you'll notice that, yeah, once again, Mafex takes it because they were able to nail the actual shading of the skin, the actual jawline that is very indicative of Robert Pattinson coming through right there. And for me personally, one of the little details that stands out is the stitching you can get on the mask. You can actually see the little divots and the little stitchings kind of blending all the different pieces of the cowl together. And yeah, you see a little bit of that lining happening on the Figuarts, but you don't see the stitching. You don't have those little dashes that make up the mask. Furthermore, the skin tone is just a little bit too orangey for my taste. But to me personally, the biggest offender, they painted his eyes a little bit too much with that sheen look. They utilized some kind of paint that makes it look like his eyes are completely glossed over, and we have a Batman with glaucoma over here versus that of the Mafex. It's a bit more matted out. You can actually see his eyes. Now, to kind of slightly contradict myself here, the eyes themselves are painted just a little too cross on the Mafex. And ironically enough, despite once you get past that little sheen that makes it very difficult to even pinpoint the eyes and the pupils inside of those eye sockets inside of the Figuarts version, they're actually looking straightforward versus that of the Mafex. So it's kind of, pros and cons, but if we are to look at least what makes things much more important in terms of likeness, Mafex does have it in fact in the bag. Before we move on, you may have noticed that there's some very peculiar display stands holding up these figures throughout the video. That's because I am collaborating with Elevate Figure Displays, and they're pretty much these hexagonal, very sophisticated looking displays to be able to hold your action figures, ranging from the 4-inch to the 7-inch scale, such as the McFarlanes, and even, yes, the Mafex and Ace Figuarts. And what I like about them is the customizability and the variations that you can use them to display your figures, make sure they don't fall over, and making sure that they look cool in the process. To me, one of my favorites would have to be the elevated hexagonal displays, specifically the one that's 3 pretty much conjoined together so that you're able to elevate the height of your different figures and being able to kind of make things very flush and very neat, especially this translucent piece that has the little foot stand so that you're not necessarily fitting it into a peg. You're rather sliding the foot right into the little crevice there. That way it blends seamlessly into the figure while at the same time holding them up. If you guys want to check out Elevate Figure Displays, there's going to be links in the description and in the pinned comment. They are affiliate links, just a full disclaimer out there. And if you manage to pick something up, use my code DarkSpiderDavid to get 10% off your order. Now, back to the video. And if we're going to be keeping it real, those knee guards right there are most certainly and objectively much more accurate on the Mafex. You can see how much flatter and more screen accurate they are versus the cylindrical stuff that's happening here on the Figuarts. But that's because of the articulation, which is a perfect segue into getting into the mobility and posability of both figures respectively, and exactly where their strengths and weaknesses are. Now, both of them have kind of like the same exact articulation when it comes to the head, which is slightly able to rotate to the left and to the right on the Figuarts. Kind of gets a little stuck, but you can tilt it upwards to fully rotate it all the way around at the top of the joint. It's towards the bottom of the joint that things start to get a little sticky, and I've tried it already a couple of times, but that results in the whole head and neck joint popping off for obvious functional reasons later on. And the same thing could be said about the Mafex. You have pretty much a head and neck joint or neck piece that has joints at the top and the bottom. However, it does feel just a little bit more snug, doesn't feel as loose or squeaky. You do have quite a bit of tilting happening in all kinds of directions, but no real 360-degree movement like I generally like to have in my figures, especially from these companies. But that's because of the collar right there and the way that the overall head is sculpted, so that's just going to come with the territory. Once we get to the shoulders, though, we get into some muddy areas because the Mafex, once you're able to move the wires from the cape, you are able to fully rotate the arms 360 degrees vertically and even extend them towards the sides. You then get a little bit of funkiness happening with those shoulder pads because on the Mafex, they only have really one hinge and they're able to move upwards like so. So they kind of have like all these flaps that just are dependent on how you're moving the arm overall. Whereas with the Figuarts, we have kind of like a two-part problem because A, obviously because of the way that this stupid plastic piece is in place with the cape, you cannot vertically rotate the arms all the way around. You can lift them up and lift them down. However, there's really no point in doing so anyways because once again, god damn it, Figuarts, what are you guys doing with your joints? These guys started off pretty smooth, and then as I moved them even more, similar to that of Gwen, the Across the Spider-Verse Figuarts Gwen, similar to Toby from the No Way Home line, the joints started off doing pretty well, and then over time, or at least after like 2 or 3 movements or uses of those joints, they started to squeak and get stuck together, almost as if they're wearing down onto the joint and it's becoming stuck. And I can kind of feel just a little bit of resistance happening very similarly to Pattinson's shoulders here on the Figuarts. Now, I'll give them some credit to give a little bit of a better function, or I guess solution to the shoulder pads, because they're on these ball joints that allow them to kind of shift in different directions versus the simple hinge on the Mafex, so that's pretty cool. But then it becomes kind of useless or pointless for them to have gone the extra mile to give that function to the shoulder pads because A, you have this giant plastic piece covering them up, and then you can't really move the arms in any kind of direction, not even horizontally. They kind of just stop right about right there. Look at that. I start to, hear some clickiness because it's moving the piece of plastic, and I'm like, okay, what's the point? And I understand some of you are probably wondering, why haven't I covered a specific function with this cape? Trust me, you're going to want to stick around and keep watching the video because I have a little bit of an interesting detail to note on that. To keep matters even more favorable on the Mafex, not only can you properly extend a little further, not as much as I would want it towards the sides, kind of stops at the 180-degree angle right about right there, but you get butterfly joints that can allow the arm to even extend further down and give them a little bit of a shrugging motion. You can see the arm kind of extend towards the sides like that, and sure, it looks a little ugly when you have them pulled all the way out like so. It kind of makes him look like he's dislocated his shoulders, but overall, it does favor posability and even some certain poses that you could put him in and flexibility. So that's pretty cool that can still function on the Mafex. Both figures have pretty much the exact same bicep swivel that you can rotate right around that area where the armorized bicep piece is. However, the Mafex has 2 joints at the elbow that are fully able to bend the elbows almost all the way up before the gauntlet and the bicep come into conflict with one another, versus the Figuarts. The Figuarts only has 1 hinge and pretty much stops at the 90-degree angle. So that's another point for the Mafex. Ideally, though, both of them have the exact same wrist joint that is able to rotate 360 degrees as well as bend inwards and outwards, so nothing too different there. And despite differences in scale, they pretty much both have the exact same kind of torso. I was actually kind of surprised by the way that it's all molded and sculpted, except I would probably say something is a bit flatter about the Figuarts, but the joints themselves that are at play here, pretty much the same. You have that mid-torso cut. that can kind of nudge almost identically on both figures to the left and to the right, but not fully rotate the full 360 because of the way that everything is molded and sculpted around that waist area, around that torso piece, and how flat it really is. So you're able to slightly nudge left to right, but you can hear right there that it's starting to come into conflict with the piece itself. Mafex, funny enough, has this kind of shifting mechanism to the top joint that allows it to slightly crunch inwards and outwards, but not a full mobile kind of angle. So don't expect flexibility to the likes of that of McFarlane or even Marvel Legends for that matter. Figuarts kind of has that similar shift, but funny enough, you can actually crunch just a little better than that of the Mafex. So point for the Figuarts for the first time in this video. And slightly decent extension towards the back that is also favored by the waist joint. Both of them have a waist joint that allows it to pivot and shift towards the front and towards the back slightly. A little bit of crunching, just a little bit of wiggle room there, but waist articulation, horizontally at least, almost none to be found there. Once again, it feels like pieces are conflicting, and because of the way that the belt is kind of glued around that area, I just don't want to test it. I really do not want things to look too iffy or risk breaking these figures, especially for the amount of money that you end up paying for some of these things. And even though the Mafex does feel like the belt can kind of shift upwards and downwards, there's just something about the way that those belts are constructed that I'm like, something's gonna rip if I even try to do that. Now, it's time to get a little weird and wacky, because then we get into some crazy territory with the joints. Specifically, these top leg joints, because both of these companies decided to go for things just a little different with their leg joints, slightly. Definitely more so on the Mafex side of things, because with Figuarts, you get these joints that you've probably already seen before on some other figures, whether it be with Marvel, DC, other properties, where you have this joint, this really weird kind of hip piece that's covering up this top joint that allows it to really bend and flex towards the front and towards the back like you see like this. It's actually one of the most comfortable joints I've seen in companies, doing their figures, and Figuarts has always nailed it when it comes to that joint. I've always liked it, and it definitely allows extension towards the sides. You get that cylindrical piece that allows further movement there on the middle where the crotch area is. And I really like this, even though you kind of have to futz a little bit with that hip joint whenever it kind of pulls towards the back, like you're pressing the leg towards the back, but then this piece kind of shifts up. I know that Figuarts, Toby, and Andrew would often have this piece kind of just rotate on its own merit, and you kind of have to put it back in place. But still, it allows to kind of blend in the illusion to make it look like all one solid suit, and at the same time still favor that articulation. Right below it, you'll notice that you do have a thigh swivel, except on this Figuarts, I don't know if it's this specific unit or it's just the way that they made Batman here, but it's very sticky. Again, being Figuarts, it could just be them not doing things properly with the joints. And I understand that there are some makeshift solutions for that, dipping it in, soap with water, and that'll fix it and all that stuff. I'm sorry, but even if that is in fact a solution, I shouldn't have to be doing that with my figures as the consumer. I know that sounds entitled, but it's the equivalent of a company like InArt making these rooted hair figures, but then when you get it, the hair's super frizzed up and you have to pretty much play hairdresser with them. I'm like, I paid the money to have these things look pretty cool right out the box. If I mess it up myself, then okay, that's user error. But when it comes out of the box like that, I'm sorry, but no, there's a reason for where that money goes to. And while we're on the subject of distinct joints that Figuarts is known for, those knee joints, despite sacrificing accurate looks to the knee guards, you do have those two cylindrical pieces right here that give you two joints, 2 points of articulation for the knee that are fully able to bend all the way up. And you've seen these joints on Figuarts before, and they still feel pretty fluid and comfortable. Mafex said, nah, we're gonna do something a little bit different. It's so kooky, but at the same time, I kind of love it. So you do have these two joints at the very top where the diaper / crotch area kind of is. That's perfectly flush and pretty seamless, so it looks pretty good in person. And does allow the leg to move towards the top, almost at about that angle right there, and towards the back slightly before the butt sculpt does in fact come into place. So unlike Figuarts, and I guess you could toss this up as a point to Figuarts, you don't have that piece that's covering up the top part of the joint that moves with the joint itself, so that when you move the leg, it moves that piece as well. And therefore, that could be seen as a con to have this butt piece back and covering it up. So therefore, you're not able to move the leg towards the back as much as you would on the Figuarts. So that is a little bit of a bummer. Extension towards the sides then gets a little funky because this joint does not move. It does not. When you do leg extensions, this piece doesn't move. The thigh swivel does, because the thigh, along with the joint rod, you could call it, that's in there, is sculpted so weird at an askew angle. You can kind of see how it's diagonal like this, that you're able to rotate the leg inside of it, but you'll notice that it's just sculpted really funky and it shifts in place. So when you extend, it's not here at the top that it's extending, it's here in the thigh. So you'll notice that top part is not moving. It's the it's the thigh leg. Look at this. This is so weird. I've never seen not only a figure, but a Mafex figure at that, do that. And when you kind of bend it towards the sides, you can do, oh, Jesus Christ, you can do that right there. So, yeah, this is a very strange joint. I don't know if I like it or dislike it, to be honest. It's definitely different. It's definitely a take. It's definitely a joint, all right? Whether or not you like it, it's up to you. And it can even kind of shift in place, like you see right there. But basically, it's built to allow further extension towards the front, not much towards the back, because like I said, that butt's going to get in the way. But when you extend, that is pretty much what's causing it, not the top joint. I've never seen not only a Mafex, but a Figuarts do that, or even just a figure in general. Like, holy shit. You can do the same thing over here, only you do have some slight limitations due to the holster that he has on the thigh, as well as some of the pieces that are kind of dangling off of his belt. So do be careful to not break any of those, although they're made of this flexible kind of rubber that does slightly bend out of the way. But once you kind of get a feel for these joints, it's really up to you to decide if you really like them or want to see them return. Then when we get to the knees, despite being much more screen accurate, they do have two joints. However, they don't feel as comfortable as that of the Figuarts. Ironically, I actually do prefer the fluidity of the Figuarts here. Yeah, you are able to bend similarly, so it's the same exact kind of joints directions, but they feel a bit tighter and snug that doesn't feel all that great in hand. Once you get past that, however, we then meet in the middle again for both figures. Once we get to the feet, they both offer pretty much the same ankle joints that, funny enough, are both limited in the same capacity. They can both slightly nudge up and down, but they can't really bend as much as I would like them to. They can fully rotate the whole 360 degrees at the bottom of the ankle, and they can slightly pivot inwards and outwards to provide an extra amount of stability. But I'm not going to lie, both of them are a little bit on the weak side. Both have trouble standing on their own. I would probably argue that maybe the Mafex is a little better at standing, only because he's got a less top-heavy cape, and it's dragging less. But even then, that's not really saying much. Both have given me quite a bit of trouble when it comes to stability of the ankle joints. The hell? Why is this one sticking? Okay, this one, the Mafex even are sticking just a little bit, so do be careful with those joints. But yeah, they are there, and they're pretty much fundamentally the exact same joint, and both even offer some toesy articulation. However, they both kind of stop. Actually, I would say maybe the Mafex is a bit more on the generous side, but they do pretty much the same exact function. Now, despite their scale, they're both still premium figures, and when it comes to premium quality figures from these two companies, usually the thing that really exasperates the reason for why you're paying so much money is not just going to be the scale and the quality of the figures, it's going to be the accessories. And once again, similar to the figures themselves, you're going to have an awful lot of bleed-in or blending together where you have some similarities, but then some pretty stark differences. Where things are going to blend a little bit more together are going to be the hands, obviously. You have a total of 10 extra hands for the Figuarts that range between, of course, you have the default fisted hands on the figure itself, but then you're going to have some really open hands, some slightly clenching hands, other hands that are designed to hold different accessories, the other secondary accessories that he comes with. And I really don't want to break down each and every single one. You have a total grand of 12 hands, 6 pairs, and they range with different gestures. And the reason for why it becomes a little exhaustive to list every single variation of hand and try to title them and try to describe exactly what they are was because Mafex decided to see the gamble that Figuarts threw in for their variety of hands and raise them up a notch. Not only do you get the 10, you get a whopping 16 hands. I can barely fit them in frame. They are right here. 16 hands on the side. So that's a total of 18 hands together, 9 pairs. And per Mafex's tradition, they are both held together. They're all the pairs are held together via these little plastic pieces to kind of bring them together and keep them enclosed and nice and neat and tidy. And it would be even more nuts to try to describe exactly what you're having here with the different gestures and poses that you have with the hands. The best way I can describe it, and that's not to say that Figuarts didn't do the same thing either. Both companies pretty much did this method where they took the hand, closed it, and then they opened it, and then they took almost like screenshots in the time lapse between the closed hand and the open hand, and just decided to sculpt different variations of the hand opening and closing to hold different gadgets and form different gestures. It just so happened that Mafex decided to make much more variations than Figuarts. And of course, there's going to be different functions, most notably the poses, the different gestures you can have them in, but most notably how they compare and they kind of fit together with the rest of the ensemble of accessories they each both come with. Naturally, when it comes to any Batman figure, one of the things that you look forward to getting when it comes to premium quality figures from Figuarts or Mafex are going to be alternate heads. And that's not just for Batman, but also for Spider-Man. Any character that has to do with a mask of some kind and comes from a property where they take off that mask, you look forward to having a variation where you can put him with the alternate head, the unmasked head. And you can see right here that both of them come with their respective Robert Pattinson face sculpts, but you can see that they both tried with something a little bit different, and once again, Mafex takes the cake. You have the much more favorable and screen-accurate look to the Robert Pattinson. Sure, it may not still be all that screen-accurate. I can see that they tried to go for a Pattinson likeness, but there's still just a little bit something off. Whereas Figuarts, to me, it looks like a caricature of Pattinson. You know what I'm saying? Like, if they were to make the Batman animated series, this is pretty much what he would look like. It also doesn't help that, yeah, I understand what they were trying to do with the eye makeup, but it just looks dirty on this particular version, especially with the matted down hair, how he pretty much he has a neutral look to his overall head sculpt, but then you add the eye makeup, it just doesn't look all that pleasing. Whereas over here, they decided to go with a very combed look to the hair sculpt that actually looks pretty neat. The skin tone is much more accurate. I mean, he looks a lot more pastier, which is what he's supposed to look like in the movie. I'm sorry, but the guy's not exactly catching that much sun. He's staying indoors. He's a bit of a recluse, a bit of an introvert, much like me. Whereas this guy is a bit more on the rosier cheek kind of aesthetic. So this one makes just a little bit more sense. Again, not the most screen accurate still, but still it's able to edge out the competition. And if that wasn't enough, this is the only head sculpt that Figuarts decided to throw in on the side, whereas with Mafex, not only do you get this head sculpt and even the additional neck piece so that you're able to swap out both pieces to make it look a bit more accurate, but with Mafex you then get 2 more head sculpts, bringing a grand total to 4 overall head pieces that you're able to swap out. One of which is yet another mask head, and it pretty much looks identical except for, of course, the angry grimacing face plate down there at the mouthpiece that shows off the teeth that aren't exactly the best etched teeth, but still, it's a variation with a different emotional look to the overall face. And then to me, in my opinion, the one that I probably favor the most is going to be this much more messed up, just recently unmasked head sculpt of Bruce Wayne. That is pretty similar to that of this one over here, only this time you get much fluffier hair, like he just took off the mask, has helmet hair, and he has much more pleasant looking eye makeup that looks very similar to that scene where he takes off the mask and he's watching that video of his dad's campaign. This is pretty much replicating that look from that scene. And Mafex kind of nailed it. Again, not exactly the most screen accurate. I don't see 100% the likeness there, but it's still leaps and bounds over whatever it is that they were trying to do over here. And if that wasn't enough, if you want to do something with these additional hands, you can have a pair or two hold this unmasked cowl, this empty cowl. That way you're able to utilize this head and this thing together for a really cool pose to fully recreate that scene. Now on to the gadgets, which once again we have some similarities and some differences. Both figures decided to have their take on the removable chest piece with the empty socket in the middle that then reinforces the notion that you can pose the figure to be replicating yet another scene from the movie where he decides to take the bat symbol from his chest and utilize it as like a cutting knife or a glorified letter opener like he does in that scene where he investigates the Riddler's apartment, and both of them come with said blade. That's right here, pretty much the bat symbol, only this time stretched out and firm to make it look like a blade. Frankly, I feel like they're almost identical. They even both have the slightly airbrushed effect. It really depends on preference. You'll then notice that in order to distinguish the two between the Figuarts and the Mafex, look no further than the little yellow aesthetics, the little yellow accents they still added onto the paint. And you'll see that the Mafex one has the much more gold accented version versus the yellow, light yellow, green yellow-ish type of tint to the Figuarts one. Aside from that, again, they're pretty much identical, so there's really not one that's better than the other. Same thing goes for that empty chest piece. They even both have rods on the back that firmly are placed in the middle where you're able to swap out the chest pieces that they come with. All you have to do is just dig your nail inside. They're a little bit firmer than I would want them to be, but once you get them out, just make sure not to rip any of the rods when you pull them from one direction versus the other, and you're able to swap them out easy peasy. Both figures also come with the spring-loaded grapple guns, if you want to call them grapple guns. Basically, it's the little mini insta-grapple that comes out of his gauntlets like he does after he knocks out Gordon and he's trying to get out of the police building. And they're pretty much similarly sculpted, except Mafex, ironically, is a little on the smaller side, a bit more compact, and frankly a little easier to lose, whereas the Figuarts comes with additional little detail and chrome accented paint here on the middle little wind-up part. And then you'll notice that the reason for why the Figuarts is bigger is because it's got an extra little piece here, a little rod, plastic area. And the reason for that is because if you look at the gauntlets, on the inside part of his gauntlets, you actually have the grapples. However, they're sculpted to look like they're completely compartmentalized and ready for action. If you dig your nail inside, you can actually remove said piece and you'll notice that you have a very even horizontal slot, and that's pretty much where this extra piece fits in to then pose the figure to make it look like he's now has a spring activated grapple gun on one of his gauntlets, and as such you're able to swap out the hands to then put on one of the clutching hands to make it look like he's holding the grapple in hand and recreate the scene from that movie. So that's pretty cool, a very intuitive way to kind of swap things in and out and still favor the level of customizability within Figuarts. Mafex pretty much did a similar thing, only in a different direction. It's actually pretty curious that they both decided to take their own unique approach on the spring-loaded grapple gun in their own personal way. Instead of doing this little slot piece that you have to remove in order to fit this thing in there, and therefore to give you pretty much two, so you can put one on the left and one on the right, depending on orientation. Whereas with Mafex, they didn't allow that. Instead, they decided to just give you some additional gauntlets. When I was seeing these inside of the box and I was pulling them out of the box, I thought to myself, they look completely identical. What am I missing? What is the difference? What's the catch? And as I rotate them, I noticed that this area right here is completely smoothed out, and I looked inside of the figure, and sure enough, the sculpting of a compressed spring-loaded grapple is inside by default. So all you have to do is just swap these gauntlets out if you want to pose them with the grapple guns that are therefore molded much more smaller than the Figuarts for that very reason, because they don't have that extra rod to fit into the gauntlet and use that style of technology, if you want to argue that. So therefore, they decided to take it in a different approach. It is a little funky to get the gauntlets removed. They are holding onto this rod that all you have to do is just slip them out. So it's a little weird. It almost makes you feel like you broke the joint because of the way that the joint is sculpted when you slide it out, but that's exactly how it's supposed to be. And once again, pretty intuitive. All you have to do is just pull them out, swap them out for the other gauntlet, and therefore you have a method to be able to pose them with screen accurate look to make it look like he's deploying the grapple. So yeah, I was thoroughly fascinated with how many different things they decided to incorporate here amongst the traditional accessories you expect from these companies. Then we get into just one or two extra little doodads here that they decided to throw in for each respective figure that you don't get versus the other. You get a cylindrical accessory of some kind, only with Figuarts you get what I'm assuming is the adrenaline pin that he injects himself with at the end of the movie on his thigh. And it's pretty much this grayed out piece with a little nozzle that feels like it's easily breakable and easy to lose. So do be careful with that. But I'm assuming that it's the adrenaline pin. I really cannot think of it as any other form of accessory. That's the only end result that I can think of. Whereas this is way too big to be the adrenaline pin. And therefore, I am assuming this is going to be the flare that he's able to activate when he's trying to save those people. So that's pretty much what you get versus the other. And lastly, with the Figuarts, you get this set of handcuffs that are pretty decently sculpted and painted, and not the biggest of deals. With Mafex, however, you get not one, but two of much more thought of grapple guns. So these aren't meant to be the insta-grapples that he has built into his gauntlets. This is a legitimate grappling gun with a full-on piston, trigger, everything sculpted and painted into the actual build of the gun itself. You even have a grapple hook here at the front, the one that he pretty much utilizes when he tries to get up to Riddler's apartment. And overall, I really dig the look of this gun right here. You can utilize it with any of the hand accessories he comes with. But once again, Mafex trying to keep the illusion of, customizability and screen accuracy intact. They threw in an extra version of the grapple gun, only this time no grapple at the front, but instead it's wrapped inside of this holster. So that made me wonder, what the hell? It comes with a holster, and you have this little peg on the other side. This can only mean that yes, you can go on the figure and remove the empty holster that was on his thigh and swap it for the one that actually comes with the grapple gun holstered in there. So if he is in a neutral pose, that's technically what he's supposed to come with. If you have the empty one on him, that means that he's pretty much meant to be posed with the actual grapple gun in hand. So I'm actually, for posterity, gonna swap it and leave this off. And technically speaking, that is it for the accessories, but we do have a slightly unique case. Mafex decided to still give you some additional value and throw in, of course, that plastic base with the arm, the variations of the arm, so that you're able to assemble it and pose them in a variety of ways. And that almost automatically gives them the leg up over Figuarts. I mean, come on. The fact that Figuarts is now pretty much not giving us too many bases nowadays, we have to buy them secondhand off, third-party market or whatever, is a bummer. However, there's a very unique case with my unit of the Figuarts, because you'll notice that upon removing the chest plate, almost as if you're going to be swapping it for the one without the bat symbol blade, you'll notice you have pretty much a good look at the innards. It's almost like he's got nipples going on right here underneath, but that's actually the little butterfly joint to allow the shoulders to move a little bit more towards the front and towards the back, a la the usual Figuarts. But you'll then see that right above that, right in the middle, there's actually a tab that is attached to the plastic casing that is holding the shoulders down and the cape in place. So upon removing not only the head but also the neck piece, you can then lift the tab that is part of that plastic piece, plastic casing if you will, and remove the entirety of that shoulder guard / cape. And you can actually remove the entirety of it all together. So you can actually get this out of the way. And then you can either put the chest plate back, put the head and the mask back on, and the neck piece back on to make it look like he just paraglided from the top of the police station like he did in that scene. Or you can make it look like he just unmasked himself by putting on this head right here and replicate that scene where he's watching his dad's campaign ad and he's kind of like just brooding like, oh my god, I can't believe what's happening. So that's kind of neat that you can add that little detail and make it look a little bit more screen accurate to those specific scenes. However, for my specific use case here, the reason for why this is a very welcoming sight is because it gives an exception, a reason rather, for customizers, for people who like to do custom pieces for certain figures, specifically capes, for Batman figures. I know that there's an awful lot of modifiers out there, a lot of custom builders like OT Customs, etc., that love to do custom capes with different fabric materials, different wiring, things that are either more screen accurate or just simply much more favorable for collectors out there. And here's the grand reveal. I actually bought this Figuarts from a secondhand user. I did not buy it directly from any kind of retailer or collectible shop or even Amazon for that matter. No, I bought it off of someone on OfferUp for a very cheap price, but they were throwing in a custom cape here that I was able to use as an example as to one of the little benefits, small little benefits of the Figuarts is that it does give reason to swap out capes in case you either do like the plastic casing here, if you're like one of the 2 people that do, or if you like, there goes the head, or if you would like to build your own or have someone build one for you and fit it right in place to where that original cape shell shoulder guard piece of plastic was residing previously. Now, I'll admit, this custom cape that I got from the previous user, it's not exactly the most favorable one. It doesn't necessarily have any kind of anchor point to fit into this little slot like the original piece of plastic did, but it does kind of just sit in place and wrap itself around the collar area. So if I would like to do so, I can simply just kind of keep it in place right there with one thumb and then take the chest plate back and fit it right into place to try to hold it all together. And again, it's not the tightest fit on the chest plate. I feel like it's very susceptible to coming off really quickly with a simple little tap on the sides here. So it's not as snug as it was previously because obviously this is all going to be very different. It's going to be overlapping a little bit with the pegs that hold the chest plate together. But overall, you can see that it definitely has a much more favorable look. I understand it's not exactly the best of quality. It's already kind of starting to separate and tear right here on the shoulder area, but you could always toss that up to battle damage. You could always make it seem like this looks a bit more canon-like. This looks like something he would actually make in the span of 2 years as opposed to whatever the hell Figuarts was really thinking with that original piece. The only downside of mine is that a little bit of the wiring here on the outer rim can kind of be a little exposed when tailored and finessed with incorrectly, so do be careful with that. But once you kind of futz with it and fidget around, you'll see right here that it's favoring the shoulder area just a little better than whatever the hell Figuarts concocted with that plastic shell casing. So now you can actually have these areas of the cape wrap around the shoulder very similarly, not exactly, but similar to that of the Mafex, and therefore it's able to hold its ground with that other competitor's figure. And then you simply just take the head and the neck piece again, pop it in place, and there you go. You can see that he at least looks somewhat improved. It's still not the best, but you can at least mess around with it, and there you go. See, it's a little easy for the chest plate to come off much more than originally did with that original Figuarts piece, because obviously that's manufactured. But here, at least you can go for a much more screen accurate or much overall better look. You just gotta have to play around with it a little bit. A valiant effort nonetheless, but you saw how badly I was trying to justify the Figuarts interpretation and try to find as many good things to say about the figure, while at the same time knowing that the Mafex just simply exists. And that's because arguably you already know what direction this is all going. The Mafex is arguably the better figure. There's much better refinements, there's much better improvements on scale, on quality, articulation, and then of course the bountiful amount of accessories that were able to be utilized in a way that feels purposeful. It favors articulation, it favors posability, it favors dynamics, it favors just so many things that you expect out of an $100 6-inch figure. Whereas Figuarts just has so many caveats that as isolated incidents, they don't really feel like terrible nuances, they don't really feel like make or break deals, but once they start to pile on, from the terrible cape, the shoulder guard piece you have to futz with, should you not have a custom cape available, or you just don't have the money to go and pay someone to make one for you, or buy one off the internet, secondhand like eBay or whatever, then you're kind of screwed with so many different little facets that, like I mentioned, pile on and make this kind of an undervalued figure, or at least an underwhelming figure for the amount of money that you would expect to pay through MSRP, because Figuarts goes for about $80 to $90 on average, whereas the Mafex is right now retailing for about $100 to $105, maybe $110 in some markets. And sure, it's about an extra $20, but look at exactly how much you're really getting for. And sure, you can toss it up to preference for certain little details, whether or not you want to have the functionality of the grapple fit into the gauntlets like with the Figuarts, or if you want to swap out the gauntlets altogether like with the Mafex. But for me, the added head sculpts, the added hand accessories, sure, it's a little difficult to keep track of from time to time, but there's just so much value and so many retcons happening on the Mafex that it's kind of a given. And it's almost like Figuarts knows this, because most recently, especially entering the holiday season, you're going to find the Figuarts at a very considerable discounted price. From time to time, I have seen it go for a whopping $60 to $65, almost $30 off through Big Bad Toy Store or Amazon. I gotta be honest, even with that significant gap in price, should you find it at a good sale, I still say hold off on it, save a little bit of extra cash, and go for the Mafex. Sure, the Mafex may not see any kind of sale anytime soon because of how recent of a release it is, but you really are getting what you paid for, and Mafex is the way to go. That is, of course, if you're not bothered by the fact that the Mafex figure, no matter how much more of an exceptional figure it is, has the word Marvel printed on his ass with the copyright. How does this happen? Anyways, guys, I'm gonna go try to find myself some paint or some of that, eraser kind of liquid to cover this up. In the meantime, if you guys enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button. If not, hit the thumbs down. Subscribe for some more comparisons such as this. And as always, stay accurate and stay humble. I'll see you later.